Hi, this is Jim of Shiloh Qahal with a deliberation on something I call the gathering of Israel. And and I'm considering the gathering in the context of the promise of high or everlasting life or life in a spiritual body and the promised land, which is the new Jerusalem or New Jerusalem, Mount Zion, the Qodesh mountain, and the coming of Messiah, which is his second coming to rule in the kingdom and reign of Elohim. And so the concepts of the coming gathering and the promised everlasting life and the regathering into the promised land and then the reign of the Messiah at a second coming. That is interspersed throughout all of the writings, the original or old writings that are part of what our translations consider the Old Covenant writings. It's interspersed throughout. You just really once you become aware of the concepts, you just can't miss them. They're everywhere. But there are some major places, some prophetic utterances in Jeremiah 30, 31, Ezekiel 11, 36 and 37, Deuteronomy 29 and 30, Jubilees 1, and then Isaiah just throughout all of Isaiah everywhere you turn. And so um, they are discussed there. But what I would like to do in this video is differentiate, if I can, because there are the scatterings of Israel, the northern kingdoms, and then also then the southern kingdoms, and then there are some gatherings that have taken place. So the point of and the objective of this video is to distinguish between those and identify and try to emphasize the gathering that will take place at the end of time, at the day of Yahuwah, when Messiah breaks through the clouds and sends his angels out to gather Israel, gather his elect, his chosen Israel, the Gentiles who have enjoined him. At that time that he's gathering them all, well, that is the gathering, and that is what we also call the rapture or the resurrection as well. And and so it's not really possible to have a discussion, I don't think, in with regard to the gathering until you talk about what happened and the scattering. So just a quick, if I can, a quick history. They come and they form as a nation. Moses gives them the Torah, the instructions, reveals his ways and the ways that they should go. And if they will follow him, they would have been blessed. But if they didn't follow him, they were not going to be blessed. They were going to be judged. And from the very beginning, in Deuteronomy 29 and 30, is the discussion of how they will not go, they will not follow him, and they will follow their own ways and end up in judgment. And as is prophesied in Deuteronomy 29, and the land became scorched. The land itself, the whole area became a problem. But then also, Israel was removed from the land. They have been scattered. They have been cast to the winds and amongst the Gentiles, and they did that, and that was because of disobedience. So, though, there have been some gatherings, and we need to discuss the scatterings that took place in order to discuss the gatherings. And so, to do that, I've created a little spreadsheet, and I'm going to take you through it here a little bit just to kind of discuss these concepts. So, let me get over there. Well, actually, before I go there, let me discuss a little bit without taking you through to the scriptures. If you spend time in the scriptures, you will see it. There is a description of the promised land that when they are gathered, they are going to be gathered into the promised land where they will, there's a whole discussion about what that looks like. They will, abundance everywhere. Um, it is everything that we imagine. I don't like using the word utopia, but in the world, they come up with this idea of utopia, which is this idealistic land, which is what we see described throughout Isaiah. We see it described in Revelation. It is the time of the New Jerusalem. It is the time when, he wipes away all the tears and the lion lays down with the lamb and the child plays with the adders, and just there is no killing. It's just all, it's wonderful. And that time is coming. And that time, when you get into Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the other descriptions of the promised land, it is when they are gathered and they are brought back in, they are made never to, they're going to be protected and they will never be afraid again. There are just so many descriptions that go along with what I'm calling, not, well, I mean, I'm going to say that what I'm calling the gathering into the promised land. It looks like what we expect it to look like at the end of time, when the millennial period comes down, when the New Jerusalem comes down. And that's what you see described throughout the old writings when you are talking about what the promise is. So there is a promised gathering, a promised land, and a gathering into that promised land. And that is the promise. That is the expectation. That's what we are all expectedly waiting for. And those who have passed and died, they're waiting in Sheol and still waiting for the promised land to come down, the promise to come down, the promised life, the resurrection, the rapture. We're all gathered into the New Jerusalem and the promised land, which is be a subject of another video here. But then I'm going to, as I'm the point of this video will be to distinguish that promise, those promises, from what has occurred in the gatherings that we've seen so far. So I'm going to juxtapose the gatherings against the scatterings, and the gatherings that have occurred against what the promised gathering is. Okay, so let me get started. So we have the formation of Israel in 1446 under Moses, and then the 40 years of the wandering, and then they come out and they, under Joshua, go into the land and begin to conquer Canaan, and they did that for 7 years, really more like 11 years. Is it 11? No, maybe 21 years before the period of the judges begin in 1385 BC, and then the period of the judges run from 1385 BC to 1055 BC, at which time Saul becomes the anointed king of Israel at the time. And Israel was, they were renowned through the land, but they weren't necessarily all that unified. And Saul probably did some things to unify them somewhat, maybe, I don't know, but ultimately he is replaced by David and the Davidic lines. And under David, then David begins the unification of and the bringing together of Israel into a real powerhouse of the land. And then furthering his work is Solomon, his son Solomon, who becomes king upon his death. And Solomon, in his early days, does much to unify and just conquer and just Israel was a powerhouse. There was the powerhouse in the land at the time. But at the end of his reign, as sin had crept into his life and into his reign, the kingdom ended up being split upon his death. To the south, in the southern kingdoms in Jerusalem, we have Judah, or the southern kingdom, which is where the reign of Solomon, his lineage, went. I mean, his lineage through Rehoboam went to the southern kingdoms and continued to reign. To the north, we had Jeroboam, who wrested the 10 tribes out of the hands of Rehoboam. So basically, in the north, in the northern kingdom called Israel, we had kings, but they were not of the Davidic line, so they were not the kings. And all of those kings, every one of them, did evil in the sight of Yahuwah. So it only took about 200 years, a little over 200 years, for that nation, that kingdom, the northern kingdom, to fall so far into disobedience that their land becomes destroyed. And ultimately Assyria, who had become the reigning powerhouse of the land, they come into the land and conquer and carry the people away to Assyria. And so the Assyrians relocate the 10 tribes of Israel into their lands, and then relocate the people of their lands back into the land of Israel in the northern area of what we understand to be Israel today, which is where the Samaritans come from. Shomaranites, I believe they're called. Um, and they, having gone to Assyria, ultimately Assyria, and I'll come back to this, but Assyria ends up being conquered by Babylon and different things. So the people of that land, the 9.5 tribes that went up into Assyria and where they were relocated to, well, they began to also spread out from there too. And we have history of them going apparently to the east, the far east, to the Philippines and those areas. Interesting teachings about things like that, of that. And then we have some of them who remained in that general vicinity of Assyria. Many of them went into the Macedonian areas, which would be the lands of Turkey and the areas that Paul ended up going into in his missionary journeys, etc. So they began to spread out. And really, as we know prophetically, they have spread out through the whole world. They have, I'm sure they've really almost they have become called the lost tribes of Israel, because really nobody knows for sure where they are. There are pockets where people identify with them, um, identify with the 10 tribes, but as a grouping of people and in mass, in large, they've become more or less lost. And there has been no regathering of the 9.5 tribes, no mentionable, not significant regathering of the 10 tribes. I think many of the people of the 10 tribes would have migrated back into the lands of, you know, Judea and Galilee, which would be north of Samaria during the days of Messiah. We know of at least one account of the widow woman in the temple who had been widowed for many years, who was of the tribe of Asher. But effectively, I mean, in essence, really, the northern kingdom has been scattered and really has no meaningful or noteworthy regathering to this day. So after the exile or the scattering of the northern tribes, the southern tribes continued for another 130, 40 years. Well, what would it be? 110 years or so. They continued in the south. They had a mixed bag of kings. And just, after having a good king under Hezekiah, they had a terrible king under Manasseh who led them into terrible, terrible sin. It was, if he wasn't the worst, he almost had to be the worst. And Yahuwah even refers later in one of the writings that that even though Yoshiyahu or Josiah, who followed him, was a wonderful king, still for the sins of Manasseh, the southern tribes, Yehuda, remained under judgment. Uh, Plus, also, it was, when you read Josiah, he had a heart for Yahuwah, but the people really did not. There were some that turned with him, but many and most really turned against him. But Yoshiyahu, who had followed Manasseh, who had followed Hezekiah, Yoshiyahu came on the scene, or Josiah, as we know him in the modern translations. He came on, had a heart for Yahuwah, and for many years led the people righteously and rightly. But towards the end of his reign, um, the Assyrians, actually, during the reign of Hezekiah, the Assyrians came down and tried to take Jerusalem, but they were thwarted by Yahuwah. There's a whole story. I won't go into it there, but the Assyrians did try to, after taking the northern kingdom, they tried to come down and take the southern kingdom, but Yahuwah thwarted that effort under Hezekiah's reign. After Hezekiah, we had Manasseh that took everything that was good that Hezekiah did and just really turned it around, and just all the good that Hezekiah had done was undone in the reign of Manasseh, and then to a lesser extent Amon, who followed him, but Amon was not on the throne very very long. And then following Amon was Josiah, who then went about the business of trying to fix what Manasseh had done, but it was a long way to go. So all that to say that Assyria still remained the power under Josiah, but during Josiah's days, Babylon was rising to power and challenging Assyria, and Egypt was also coming up, who had always been, in and out of being a powerhouse, a strong kingdom, a strong empire, and they were challenging. And so during the time of Josiah, we had Babylon fighting with the Assyrians, and then we had Egypt coming up to do battle against Babylon. And for whatever reason, towards the end of Josiah's reign and ultimately his life, as Egypt was coming up to do battle with Babylon, Josiah decided he wanted to go out with some of his army to fight with Egypt. And he was even called out by the Pharaoh of Egypt. Why are you coming to fight me? I'm called here. Why are you going against Yahuwah? Uh, and really, Josiah also got. I mean, there was some prophetic words. He was not called to go out against the Pharaoh. And ultimately he did. He went out and fought and was wounded, mortally wounded in battle, came back to Jerusalem where he died. And because he did not have, because he died in that manner, the people then appointed, let's see, Jehoahaz is how we know him over here. Jehoahaz is the typical the way it's written in modern translations, also known as Yehoahaz Shalom. But he didn't last long. It's almost immaterial because even though the people appointed him, Egypt was in that moment, the strength of the land, and they came and deposed him, and they took him down to Egypt, where and he was a son of Josiah or Yoshiyahu. Egypt took Jehoahaz Jehoahaz down to Egypt and appointed in his stead another son of Yoshiyahu, who was Jehoiakim, or Jehoiakim, as our modern translations show. And Jehoiakim reigned, I don't remember how many years, but it was a number of years, 13, 14 years, something of that nature, for a little bit. But as he came on the throne, Pharaoh was still as he came on the throne, Pharaoh was still fighting with Babylon and was just in the throes of losing to Babylon. So as Jehoiakim comes on the scene, Egypt is the current power of the land, but is in the throes of losing to Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, who is coming on the scene at the head of the Babylonian Empire. So during the first 3 or 4 years of Jehoiakim's reign, they are subject really to Egypt. Egypt is the primary power there, but then Egypt gets conquered by Babylon, and so then Israel becomes subject to, and Joachim becomes subject to Nebuchadnezzar. And that's around the 3rd and 4th year of Jehoiakim. And about that same time, as Nebuchadnezzar comes into power, we have really our first exiling of people from the land of Israel. The book of Daniel reveals that in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the sovereign of Yehuda, when Nebuchadnezzar, the sovereign of Babel, came to Jerusalem, in that year there were some nobles, some children of the kings, and some others and some of the utensils were taken away by Nebuchadnezzar at that time. Included amongst those that were taken away in that moment, which would have been around 606 to 604 BC. That's when Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were carried off into Babylon. So this is actually before what most people think of as the carrying away of the exiles into Babylon. So let me just do a quick recap of this time. So we have, as Yoshiyahu or Josiah is coming to the end of his reign, we have a power struggle taking place. Assyria is the current empire of the land, but they are doing battle with Babylon to their east, and Egypt from the south is coming up to also enter the fray, mostly against Babylon, because during this period of time, Babylon is conquering and winning. And within just a year or two after this, or just a little bit of time, Nebuchadnezzar defeats Assyria, and they become the power of Babylon, takes over the Assyrian Empire and all of that northern land, all of all of the north, the lands of Babylon, the lands of Assyria. But in the midst of that, you had Egypt coming up from the south to also contend for power in the lands of Israel and the Holy Land. Um, and as they come up to fight with Babylon, they are defeated by Babylon. And in the throes, during the time that they are fighting Babylon, is when Josiah goes out and tries to fight against Egypt, is mortally wounded. Uh, while Egypt is still contending for the land, is when Jehoahaz becomes king, but is deposed immediately by Egypt, who is the momentum or the current power of the land, removes him immediately, replaces him with Jehoiakim, and right in the beginning, Jehoiakim is subject to Egypt, but almost right after that, Nebuchadnezzar defeats Egypt, and Egypt ends up leaving the area, and that leaves the vacuum, and now we have Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon as the sole power of the land at the end of that time. And that's the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, and he immediately came down to Jerusalem and to Jehoiakim and subjected Jehoiakim and Israel immediately. And that's when they took away Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who we know as Daniel, Hadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. From the book of Daniel. And so in that moment, in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, which was the third or fourth year, depending upon which book you read and how you're measuring it, the third or fourth year of Jehoiakim after Josiah's death, then Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes away the first grouping of people in around 606 to 604 BC. Around 605 BC did they take away that first grouping of people. And it's during this time, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, that he has the dream that Daniel ultimately interprets. And then in the seventh year of Jehoiakim, which is in the third year of Nebuchadnezzar, then Jehoiakim begins to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar and put up, just begins to resist. And Nebuchadnezzar begins to send raiding parties into the land. But then Jehoiakim dies in around 598 or 597, and Jehoiakim, whom we will know up here as, see if you can see what I'm pointing at. Jehoiakim is one of his names. Yekoniah is one of his names. Yekonyahu is one of his names. Konyahu, Konyah, Koniah, Jehoiakim, I think is how most people will pronounce it. And that's what we see in most of our modern translations is this Jehoiachin, but he's also known as Jeconiah. He's known by a lot of names. So immediately upon, so Jehoiakim dies, and Jehoiakim is made king for 3 months, and immediately Nebuchadnezzar comes down and besieges Jerusalem or Jerusalem, and then Jehoiakim does what he was instructed to do by Jeremiah, and that is subject yourself, do not resist, go with Nebuchadnezzar. And so Jehoiakim did that. He came out after 3 months of reigning. He came out when Nebuchadnezzar came down and besieged Jerusalem. He came out with his mother, his family, his servants, his heads, his eunuchs, everybody, and came out and basically surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar. And this is considered the primary time that the exile occurs. During that time, and at that time, according to 2 Kings chapter 24, about 10,000 people are exiled, about 7,000 mighty brave men, 1,000 craftsmen. According to Jeremiah, 3,023 are exiled. And then Nebuchadnezzar carries Jehoiakim off to Babylon with him. And then so Jehoiakim and this grouping of people went off into Babylon as they were commanded to do by Jeremiah. And so while they were there, they were actually taken care of by Yahuwah while they were there, as was Sidkiyahu. I'm not Sidkiah, I'm sorry, Jehoiakim. Now, Nebuchadnezzar appoints Sidkiyahu or Zedekiah, and most of us know that he is one of the sons of Jehoiakim. And so he's a rightful king, but he's not the original king. And it's under Zedekiah, when he's appointed, that he's a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar for a while. But then shortly thereafter, around 589 to 588 BC, in Sidkiahu's ninth year, in fact, in the ninth year, 10th month, and 10th day, he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar then besieges Jerusalem, and then in 586, 587 to 586, in Zedekiah or Zidkiyahu's 11th year, the city is breached, and then Nebuchadnezzar burns it all down. And then at the end of that, as Jerusalem is destroyed, as it's destroyed in 582, 581 BC, some more people are exiled. So we have three different exiles taking place. And that's the real point here, is that we have an exile that takes place in the third year of Jehoiakim, and that includes Daniel and his peeps. And then you have another exile taking place. Let me also go back up here. That first exiling took place, and I'm going to just say roughly 605. It was somewhere between 606 and 604. So roughly 605 is the first exiling of the grouping that included Daniel and his peeps. And then we have a second exiling that takes place 7 or 8 years later in 598 to 597 BC that includes and is the primary exile of those who went voluntarily, more or less, that took place. And then we have a third exile that took place another 11 years later, when Jerusalem was conquered under Zedekiah, and then, all the things that happened to Zedekiah. So by this time, I guess also there was forgive me, there's a fourth one. I forgot. In the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, there is a reference in Yirmiyahu, chapter 52, that there's another exiling of about 745 people in 582 to 581 BC. So now by this time, we have really the scattering of the southern kingdoms. Now, just some quick comments there, and let me scroll this up a little bit. Not all of the peoples were taken. There were people left in the land, so it wasn't a complete scattering of all the peoples of the land. And I would like to also make a note that the successor to Nebuchadnezzar, Ewil Merodach, lifted the head of Jehoiakim and treated him well in the 37th year of Jehoiakim's in his captivity, which would have made him, what would that be? 18 plus 37 is in his 50s. And he lifted his head. Jehoiakim is the ancestry of Messiah. So it is Jehoiakim that, through whom, not Sidkiyahu or Zedekiah, but Jehoiakim, that Messiah comes through. And also in the end, Jehoiakim is treated very well. He eats at the king's table. So that whole grouping of people, because they were obedient to Yahuwah through Jeremiah, were protected and taken care of during those times. But effectively, that completes the scattering of them during that time. Now, with regard to the gathering, many people think of, because 70 years later, the people, through Jeremiah, they know that it's time to go back. And then we have the decree of Cyrus to go back and begin building the land. And there very definitely is a regathering, a return of people to the land, where they come back and rebuild and repopulate. And I don't want to speak for everybody, but it was my understanding, without thinking it all the way through, that represented the gathering, the return of the people to the land. I don't think most people even realize and I shouldn't say it that way, but I don't know that many people realize that there is a promised gathering, the gathering. This rapture of the New Covenant writings is not new. There was a promised gathering throughout the old writings. And, I would suggest that those of us who are believers should spend more time in the old writings to learn what it's really speaking and saying, because the promise is so much greater than anything that was experienced as they came back from Babylon during that time. What they experienced in the land, and hang on a second, let me go pull another map up here. Give me a second. So here's a timeline, and let me just bring us up to speed here. So here's what I'd been describing to you. Here's the time of Josiah, and here is, if you go up in this timeline, this is time is going to the right here, and here's the time of Josiah. While Josiah, after he follows Manasseh, the terrible king, Josiah comes on, and he's a good king, and he's bringing everything back. But during his time, we've got Assyria controlling the lands. Certainly the lands just to the north of the southern kingdom. And here we've got Babylon in white here beginning to challenge Assyria up here. And then you can see that in 605 is when Nebuchadnezzar defeats Egypt at Karshemish. So while these guys are struggling for power up here, Egypt's coming up from the south and also struggling for power. And it's during this time that Josiah, if you follow this all the way up here, he goes and tries to do battle against Babylon. Against Egypt, I guess on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know what he was thinking when he went up there, but he went up here to do battle, against Egypt at the same time, and is mortally wounded. And so while this during this period of time is when we have Jehoahaz coming on the scene as the king, but gets deposed immediately by Egypt and taken to the south, and gets replaced with Jehoiakim, according to most of our modern translations, who rules for 13 years or so, 11 or 13, something like that. In the first years, he is a vassal and under subject to Egypt. But in his third or fourth year, Nebuchadnezzar wins and comes down and besieges Jerusalem and takes Daniel right here, takes Daniel. And then a little bit later, 7 years later, Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar comes down and besieges, and Jehoiakim is a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar for 3 or 4 years, but in the seventh year of Jehoiakim, he rebels, and so for the last 3 or 4 years of his life, he is rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar, who sends raiding parties down into the land of the southern kingdom. And when Jehoiakim dies, and they bring on Jehoiachin, or who I was calling Jehoiakim, it's in that 3 month period of time that Nebuchadnezzar comes down and surrounds Jerusalem, and Jehoiachin comes out and surrenders with everybody else, and they're all taken off in captivity. Zedekiah is placed in, Nebuchadnezzar puts Zedekiah in charge and makes him king of the land, and he is a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar for a few years um, before he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. And then ultimately Nebuchadnezzar comes down, and while Zedekiah is king, comes down and destroys Jerusalem. And we have the first exile here under Jehoiachin. Then we have the second exile here under Jehoiachin. And then we have a third exile that takes place when Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem. And then we have a fourth exile that takes place just a few years later. And all these folks are taken off into captivity. And then they're there for 70 years. And then during that period of time, Jeremiah, at least the early part of this, Jeremiah is prophesying. And Jeremiah is prophesying up here. Give me a second here. I'm going to get a pointer. Should have done this earlier. He's prophesying up here, and he begins to talk about returns. And he does talk about this return that takes place down here. And by the way, this is the timeline of Judah down here. And he is prophesying about the return and the return of the captives. Some of the captives, I believe some of the captives are coming from Assyria. Some of the captives are coming from all. So there are people that do come back. There is a regathering. There's a gathering together of people back into the lands of Judah down here under the leadership initially of Zerubbabel. And many of the church, me historically included, always perceived the end of this 70-year captivity to be the return of Israel back into the land. But it is not, because this Jeremiah also describes in 30 and 31, he describes what that new land, that promised land, is going to look like, and what it's going to be like when we literally come in the gathering. When we come back, there's going to be peace. There's going to be tranquility. There's going to be fullness. There's going to be, it's, he describes what's going to take place when the New Jerusalem comes down, and what Isaiah describes. He describes that, but he also describes in another regathering or another gathering what takes place here. And they just can't be, you don't want to confuse them, because the gathering Jeremiah describes is nothing like what this gathering is. If this gathering that took place after they returned from Babylon is the gathering that Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel describe, if this is that gathering, then we have failed scriptures, because that is not the promise. It cannot be the promise. But we definitely do have this regathering back into the land, where they finish the temple under Zerubbabel. They have a period of time where, if you're reading the books Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll find that even though they came back and they had some moments and some hearts immediately, some moments and some hearts toward Yahuwah, I should say. They were sincere, and what would you call it? They were sorry and repentant in the moment, but they immediately turned around and started, even the leaders and the priests and they all began to intermarry, and we had all these problems because they just immediately started going bad again, and they did all this intermarrying. And then we have this period of time where Ezra comes back later. Ezra, prophet of righteousness, one of the sons of Zadok. By the way, there's another, I haven't yet found where this is describing, where I have seen where there's another destruction of the walls of Jerusalem, but apparently there is a destruction of the walls of Jerusalem. Well, that's not going to happen in the gathering, in the promised land. That is not going to happen when it all happens. Then you got Ezra coming back during this time, and he's finding all this sin and all this stuff, and we just read Ezra, what happens. And then you got, following Ezra, you've got Nehemiah coming back on the scene. And by the way, it's Ezra. Where's Esther? Esther's up here in this timeline, because also here's where Babylon falls, and now Persia has come on the scene during this time, around the same time that we're coming back into land. Now Persia's the power of the land, the Medes and Persians, and you got Cyrus, and then you got Darius the First, and you got Xerxes, which is the king under Esther, and then you got Artaxerxes, which is the king when Ezra was there and Nehemiah was there. And then you had Darius the Second that comes on the scene. There is so much information there, but I won't go into it all. We can't go into it all. But the real question is this gathering here to be conflated or confused with the gathering Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and even Moses describe? It cannot be. If it is, we have failed scriptures. So this timeline takes us basically to 400 years BC, before the coming of Messiah here. Let me see if I can pull up. Give me a second here. So between the time of Nehemiah and the end of our book of 66 scriptures, there is this period of time that we have to go to other sources to fill in the blanks between 400 BC and the time of Messiah at, 246 BC, something like that. Well, that's the time of the Maccabees, but that's also the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's also the time of the period of where the deposition or the deposing of the sons of Zadok as the priesthood, to be replaced with the legitimate priest. A conversation and a topic for another day, but there is some history here while they are in the land. So they're in the land from roughly 536 again through 0 BC. And after Nehemiah here, they've got some histories where we get into the Hellenistic. We got the Greeks coming on the scene. We've got the Maccabeans coming on the scene. We've got the Hasmoneans coming on the scene. And after 400 years of that history that's going to take place, we have Messiah coming onto the scene, as we do with Paul and all, basically our New Testament writings and our new messianic story, to where we see the coming of the Messiah. But let me just say that during this period of time, they remain in the land, but they don't remain successfully in the land. If not just this period of time with Nehemiah and Ezra, but throughout the time of the Maccabees, throughout the time of the Hasmoneans and the Greek, lots of turmoil. None of that can possibly meet the definitions of the promised land after the return that is promised throughout all of the prophets in the scriptures. Okay, so this brings us back to the time of Messiah. And we know that during the days of Messiah, the land is a mess. We've got the Pharisees on the, in control. We've got the Sadducees running the priesthood. There's just things are not right, and we know it when we're reading, the Gospels and the rest of Scripture, the new writings. We know there are problems in the land, that it's still not right. Nothing about their return has been the ways of Yahuwah, except for obviously small pockets, and then a growing number of believers in Messiah during those times. But the land continues to have all kinds of problems, and ultimately, 70 years after Messiah's birth, in roughly 70 AD, we have the Romans, who are now the power of the land, come in and utterly destroy Jerusalem and exile the rest of the Yehudim, the people of the land. And so now we have another scattering. So after having been regathered, now we've got another scattering, which also then really eliminates that first return from being the return, because that's can't happen after the return. Either that or we have failed hope, which we don't. So it's just not an issue. We just need to properly understand what the gathering is, the return is. So now what we have is, and I'll just quickly tell you, it's roughly seen that most of the Jews Yehudim, I should say, went to the south. Egypt is one of the things I understand. But we also know that they've been scattered throughout the land. We now know that people identifying with Jews, which are, I don't really know how, that's probably a topic for another day too. What is a Yehudim? What is a Jew? What is the difference? That's probably beyond my pay grade anyway, maybe something I shouldn't and probably won't try to address. But essentially, the Yehudim have gone out throughout the whole world, as have the Israelites gone throughout. So the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom have been scattered throughout the whole world, and that is the condition today. Now, we know that we have a regathering into the land that took place in 1948. That's a topic. There's so many things we could talk about, and I don't really wish to enter that fray. What I will say is that even if they are, I don't believe they don't even identify with all of Israel. They identify with Jews, and if they're just the Yehudim or the Jews, then we still haven't regathered the rest of the tribes, and all of the tribes are going to be gathered. So what has taken place in 1948 also cannot be, even if it's a gathering, if it's a legitimate gathering, which I'm not going to enter that fray, but even if it's a legitimate gathering, it can't be the gathering, because it doesn't qualify. It doesn't include all of everybody. And what's been taking place in the land it is nothing like what the prophets tell us it's going to be like when we are literally gathered together. So we have the regathering after the Babylonian captivity, but is that the gathering? No, it cannot be. We have this gathering of Jews, Israel, whatever. We've got a gathering into Israel of people identifying with Jewry. I think I just don't want to go there. But even if it's a regathering, it also cannot be the gathering. It just doesn't qualify. Nothing about that land represents the descriptions that you'll read in Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah and the other prophets. So, what is the gathering? Well, it's a future event. It has not happened yet. And when does it happen? I may do it next. I want to do a video on Messiah and his Olivet discourse, because he gives us the timing. He gives us the timing of the day of Yahuwah, which I also want to do a video on that, so people understand exactly what the day of Yahuwah is, or the day of the Lord in most translations. But he tells us that the day of Yahuwah happens, and at the same time as the signs appear in the sun, moon, and stars, he comes on the clouds with his angels and he gathers the chosen, the elect, all of Israel, all of us who have joined ourselves to Israel, all of us, all of those who are in Sheol or in the grave, Sheol, who have been waiting in deep rest, are going to be gathered together too. That is the gathering. And where are we going to be gathered to? We're going to be gathered to not heaven, not even just the sky. We're going to be gathered to our new home, which is the New Jerusalem, a topic for another day. So let me just say that none of the things that have happened throughout history can possibly qualify for the gatherings, every time you see them, be careful when I say this. When you get into the old writings, you can read some gatherings and a lot of them associated with coming back to that land after the Babylonian captivity. But parse it. Pay attention to the differentiations when Jeremiah is talking about the gathering and what it looks like when we're gathered to the land, never to be made afraid again, never to be. I mean, you'll just have to read all the descriptions. That is the gathering, and that's juxtaposed against people coming back into the land to build the walls again and do different things. There's a big difference, and that's what I'm trying to in this video make people think about, and that is that there has been no gathering yet that qualifies for the gathering that is taught in scriptures. It hasn't happened. It's a future event. It is what the church will call the rapture, the resurrection, whatever you want to call it. It's that period of time when Messiah comes and sends his angels out and gathers us all together to enter the New Jerusalem. And so that is the gathering that we all continue to await. It is when you hear Paul teaching and speaking, it is it's the expectation. It's the promise. It's what, when you read him and you read him forward looking, that's what he's looking for. The gathering into the New Jerusalem and and I'll get to it here, the promise of high everlasting life, which is given to all of us at that moment, at that resurrection. All those that have died have not been resurrected yet. They are not in their new bodies. They are like us. They are just waiting for that promise that comes at the time of the gathering. Thanks, and may be Baruch.